Hello, everyone. I'm Cynthia Coffman, the former Attorney General of the state of Colorado. And I want to thank SNAP so much for inviting me to be part of the annual conference to talk about our experience here in Colorado with an independent review of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. This was, for me, one of the most important aspects of my work as Attorney General, and it continues to be an issue for which I have great passion and deep concern. So the chance to talk to you all about it for a little while today is very much appreciated, and I'm looking forward to including two of my friends who are SNAP members here in Colorado in a conversation in just a few minutes. First, though, I want to give you a brief introduction to set the stage and tell you about what we went through here in Colorado after the grand jury report was released by the Pennsylvania Attorney General Josh Shapiro in August of 2018. As attorney generals across the country, we were aware of General Shapiro's work, although it was quiet. It was behind the scenes, as grand jury investigations must by their nature be. And so it was only when the report was made public in mid-August of 2018 that we all became fully aware of the scope of the investigation that was done there and the magnitude of the number of priests and children who were involved in Pennsylvania's 6 dioceses that were investigated. The New York Times referred to the Pennsylvania grand jury report as the broadest examination by a government agency in the United States of sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. And it certainly brought to the attention of so many AGs around the country the need to do something similar in our states. Within a few months of the Pennsylvania grand jury report being released, I received a letter from local SNAP leaders asking that Colorado launch a similar investigation. By October of 2018, there were 13 state attorney generals who had begun investigating alleged sexual abuse linked to the Catholic Church. My staff and I spoke to many of them. Florida, Arkansas, Illinois, Maryland, Michigan, Missouri, Nebraska, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, Vermont. Your state may be among those. The legal authority to investigate and to convene a grand jury varies from state to state. And while some attorneys general, like General Shapiro in Pennsylvania, can convene a grand jury and use that body to issue subpoenas, in Colorado, the Attorney General has much more limited jurisdiction, and I could not do either of those things under the circumstances. I needed to have an active case from a local district attorney who was willing to share that case and that jurisdiction with my state office, or have a criminal conspiracy. And at that point, we didn't have the evidence that we would need, although we certainly had our suspicions based on past conduct of the church. And finally, I could convene a grand jury at the request and authorization of the governor of the state, who could send me a letter asking me to conduct a grand jury investigation. My office went ahead and established a plan to do research, and we set out a tentative timeline. We were really challenged by the fact that it was now August of 2018, an election year, and we were going to be leaving office in January of 2019. So we had a matter of a few months to put something together that could be carried on by the next Attorney General. but we were committed in my senior staff to making that happen. And we were helped greatly by our friends at SNAP. In late September, I received a letter from SNAP leadership here in Colorado, and they asked if we could have a meeting and talk about Pennsylvania, talk about what Colorado might do in terms of an investigation. And while I knew going into that meeting that it was likely that my office was going to move forward in some way, I have to say it was meeting these three gentlemen from SNAP, hearing about their work with the organization, about their knowledge of past sexual assault and abuse by Colorado priests, and also just understanding their desire to expose wrongdoing to the light. That's what put the heart and soul into our independent review in Colorado. And that's really what made the effort work. It kept us moving forward as quickly as we possibly could. It was incredibly motivating to us because we now had faces and personal stories to go along with the allegations of sexual abuse in the church. I want to share very quickly what the sequence of events was after that. So after we met with SNAP leadership, word got out fairly quickly that Colorado and the Attorney General was making inquiries about sexual abuse in the 3 dioceses in Colorado, in Denver, in Colorado Springs, and in Pueblo. And I received a phone call from the law firm that represents the Archdiocese of Denver. The lead counsel, their general counsel, I should say, was someone that I knew well. He had served as the chief counsel to the immediately prior governor, Bill Ritter, and we had worked together closely in my time in the Attorney General's office. He told me that there were no problems in Colorado similar to those in Pennsylvania. In fact, he said there had been no reports since the Archdiocese in Denver had settled 18 cases of sexual abuse by priests in 2008. I expressed my amazement at that, and as well as a certain amount of skepticism that that was an accurate representation. And I said, well, if that was in fact the case, then we should all sit down and talk about how Colorado's success could be replicated in other states and in other dioceses if they had in fact done so well at identifying and ending sexual abuse in the Catholic Church in Colorado. So we arranged a meeting in about 2 weeks' time. It was the general counsel for the church, their internal attorney, and a couple of lawyers from the law firm. And they laid out for me the history from their perspective of abuse in the Catholic Church in Colorado. And while this was a cordial meeting, certainly, there was also a show of strength and solidarity as the Archbishop in Denver also oversees Colorado Springs and Pueblo Diocese. It was clear that this was a unified message, and the message was, there's nothing to see here. So you should put away your idea of an investigation and move along, Madam Attorney General. In early October of 2018, my staff and I asked to meet with other church officials. And the Vicar General, the Bishop of Colorado Springs, the Archbishop himself, and 3 attorneys from the Catholic Church and the law firm that represent them came to meet with me and my staff. I have to say it was one of the most interesting and memorable meetings of my career as an attorney. It lasted about 90 minutes, which was frankly longer than I had expected. the church was on the defensive. The Archbishop was emotional. He clearly felt that the Catholic Church was being unfairly targeted by the press, by past victims, and by state attorneys general. We did leave that meeting, though, with an agreement that the church would cooperate with an independent review of their practices and of their records. That was unfortunately about the best we could hope for, because there was not time to get the legal authority that was needed to conduct a deeper investigation and convene a grand jury without the governor's cooperation. And so over the next 2 months, over October and November and into early December, we met every 10 days at least to negotiate an agreement that would guide an independent review. The scope of that investigation was, of course, the trickiest part. We would propose a fairly broad investigation. The church's attorneys would then come back with something much more narrow and specific. And then we would argue and we would find somewhere that we could meet. And in some cases, we had to do some trading off, frankly, of what the Attorney General wanted versus what the church wanted. One of those areas was the type of sexual misconduct that would be covered in the investigation. Another was listing of names of priests, both living and deceased. Then the time frame that would be covered by the investigation, and having a hotline for reporting, which I considered something that was non-negotiable. And SNAP had already agreed to help us with getting the word out that we wanted to hear from victims, past and current, and that we needed to know stories. People could come to us anonymously through SNAP or through our hotline, or they could come directly, but it was up to them. And we agreed pretty quickly on our independent reviewer, who was a former United States attorney here in Colorado named Bob Troyer. I wanted the agreement signed before I left office in January. The final draft was completed by then, but my successor wanted to put his stamp of approval on it after he took office. And one of the hardest things I've ever done was to turn that agreement over and trust that victims would be taken care of in the same way that I and my staff had hoped, and tried to do that during our tenure. In fact, my successor did go forward with some minor changes to the agreement, and in February of 2019, he and I and the Archbishop announced that there would be an independent review of allegations of sexual assault by priests in the 3 dioceses of Colorado. Fast forward, the report was released in October of 2019. 43 priests were listed, 160 children were counted as victims of those 43 priests. More than half of the cases happened after the state's diocese knew that the priests were abusers. I know that probably won't be a surprise to you all, but it was to the public. And of all the things that created an emotional reaction by folks on the outside looking in, that was probably the one point that everyone really keyed into, that this could have been prevented by leadership of the Catholic Church, and it wasn't. And instead, priests were shuffled from place to place. They were laundered in treatment facilities and moved, and children continued to be abused. With that, I want to introduce my friends. And I have the deepest admiration for these 2 gentlemen who made it their personal mission to work with my office to be sure that an investigation would be done and to shepherd the process beside me and then out in front of me. They continue to work diligently on the issues. And so I'm going to ask first Jeb Barrett to introduce himself and say some words, and then Mike Carpino. And then we want to just have a conversation for the remaining time with you all. Thank you. Jeb?
Let's see. I guess I'm not muted. Uh, I, I'm outside because I don't have any place inside that's uncluttered. So it's sort of like my mind and my life right now. But I grew up in Montana, Missoula, Montana, and in a very interesting family. It was my father's family was Presbyterian or Methodist or something back and forth. My mother's entire extended family was Roman Catholic, and so there was a lot of confusion about what this religious stuff was all about. But basically, we were involved in churches our whole time, and some of it was very positive of a community and learning values and so forth. However, hiding all of this, when I was 8 years old, a teenage uncle of mine moved into my bedroom. After his mother's death, he had been placed in a residential school or orphanage run by the Roman Catholic Church, and he wrote our parents, well, and some of the other relatives that if we didn't get him out of there, he was going to run away. He never told us what was going on. But today, 70 years later, 80 years later, well, 75 years later, I'm remembering, I've deduced that what he did to me was probably what was happening to him in that Catholic institution. Because I had no idea what it was all about. I was grateful to have a big brother finally. And I really kind of adored him at first because I thought I could learn things from my big brother. Well, one of the things that I learned that I probably shouldn't have been learning there was sexual in nature. And I don't talk about graphically about what happened, but all I know that is it affected me. And that uncle I need to share, I usually share. Interestingly enough, years later, when I started talking about my abuse, I learned from one of his daughters that he went on to molest 4 of his 5 daughters. And that was no secret from that point on. So he was also a raging alcoholic, and he died in his 40s from his alcohol abuse and so forth, and some of his secrets, I guess, with him. But the fact that I grew up that way, somehow or other, the next person, a scoutmaster in Montana, exposed himself to me when I was working on a project and asked me to kiss his erect penis in front of my face. That was a horrible shock. And I went running home, and I know I told my parents because we never saw that scoutmaster again. Obviously, they contacted the troop or the council and reported it and made a threat that if you don't get rid of that son of a bitch, we'll go to the police, we'll go to the newspapers. Somehow or other, that scoutmaster picked up on the vulnerability that I had because of being assaulted even earlier. And then this happened again when I was studying music at the University of Montana as a teenager at 15. My music teacher there started making passes and initiating sexual contact with me, which I found terrifying. And I will say that each time these things happen, I disassociated. So I don't have very clear feelings of the trauma. They're slowly coming back. But I know that it affected me. But I found these told him it had to stop after the fourth time or whatever. And then when I told my father, he threatened to go to the police and newspaper. I was humiliated because I still thought at that age there was something wrong with me, that I was attracting these guys, that it was something defective, and it was my fault. And that was a horrible shame to grow up with. And I really was not at all social with any of my classmates in school because I just knew I was too different. And then finally, a priest got me drunk one night, and similar things happened. And I'll never forget, as I left the room, he said, "Go with God." Now, can't stand that expression today, but um, it's interesting. I had never learned how to say no to an adult about anything. That was part of my upbringing. And I will say that when I was in the Navy, there were similar things happened that were beyond my control, not non-consensual. And even when I was at the Juilliard School, a teacher approached me and said, "You don't have to do anything." And I said, "No, we don't have that kind of a relationship." He persisted, and I said more emphatically, using what I call my father's voice, "No, we don't have that kind of a relationship." That was the first time that I had, at age 27, I guess, the personal power to say no to an adult. And that's just sort of the programming. So I went on with many diagnoses over the years that are the effects of the childhood trauma, the betrayal, the terror that I went through, and how it affected me emotionally, my emotional development, also my brain development, till I started retiring, but like 18 years ago. Um, I've been a professional musician, worked for the church as an organist and choir director, music director for many years. Well, it's over 60 years now. And um, wow, that, sometimes when I tap into my own story, I begin to have some of the feelings about the betrayal, not feeling safe. And I take a great risk in telling the things that I am right now, but I have learned that we only share our stories with people we've learned to trust. And that's one of the great things about the Survivors Network. It was in 18 years ago that I finally contacted SNAP to find out what SNAP was about, because my partner, Norman, committed suicide 36 years ago. And I knew that he had been groomed and abused, that's sanitizing word, but abused by the chancellor of the Diocese of Helena from ages 14 on up to 26 or 27. And when that priest called and wanted him to come to the retreat center the church has for their priests, he asked me what I should do. And I said, "Norman, you just say no." He had never had permission to tell an adult no. So that closed. But I will say that Norman had a great deal of problems because he was also, as I had become an alcoholic, he was also an alcoholic, and he couldn't get what was happening in what he was hearing in the Alcoholics Anonymous, and that is people would say, "If you don't get God, you're going to die." Well, Norman didn't even know the Lord's Prayer. He'd never been involved with churches, so that was totally foreign to him. So finally, 20, 30, 36 years ago, he took his own life. He fulfilled that prophecy. Okay, now, how I got involved. When I moved to Colorado in 2015, I was already involved in SNAP and trying to advocate for the protection of children, particularly against Catholic priests, nuns, deacons, bishops, but also working for some kind of justice for victims who are hiding it in shame and pain because no one would believe them, or they didn't trust anyone to hear their stories of betrayal. I moved here in 2015 and immediately got involved as a co-leader of this the Denver chapter of survivors network of those abused by priests. And at that time, we had two wonderful women in the state house, Senate President Joan Fitzgerald and Representative Wynne Green, who were working on trying to look at what can we do to bring justice for victims and to better protect children. So that was where my relationship with the State House began, and making several trips during a week down there to meet with them and committees, and developing two bills, because Rosemary Marshall was also involved with a bill that would eliminate the criminal statute of limitation for child sexual assault moving forward prospectively. And then the other bill with Fitzgerald and Green was attacking the civil bill for statute of limitations to try to help the many people that have been victimized. It was a very difficult time with hearings in the committees, and many people from out of state came to help us to testify for the bills, to expose, really, to educate the legislature and the public about the extent of the cover-up, the extent of the abuse, the impact of that early abuse on all of these lives. And knowing that what we knew at that time was only a smidgen of the number of victims hiding out there, because they couldn't legally point finger at their perpetrators. The Colorado Catholic Conference, Archbishop Chaput spent millions of dollars in fighting both bills in the initial stages, and they managed to get some other organizations on board that are also egregious offenders, but the most opposition came from the Catholic Church. And I'm not because of the money that it would involve, but because of the secret culture that has existed for centuries in the Catholic Church, where they've treated children as objects. They've done things for use. They've used children as objects in every imaginable way. We have to look back at the Sistine Choir in the 19th century, where they were still castrating children in puberty, so their voices wouldn't change, so they could have that all-boy choir with males, grown males, eunuchs in a sense, and the many other abuses that are just rampant, have been rampant, and have continued in different ways and hidden by the church. I grew up knowing very well that there was something wrong about this matter of celibacy, which technically meant not to be able to marry, but we've assumed and taken it to mean chastity. And there is a big problem that parents and others have allowed their children to be with these men that supposedly are non-sexual and to be safe. And guess what? They've taken advantage of it. My big concern, and a lot of our concern as SNAP, is not only about the children right now who are being abused, not only in the Catholic Church, because now we know that it goes through all denominations, the Boy Scouts of America and so forth. That's in the news. But I get calls every week from people who have never talked to anyone, people, men and women in their 50s, their 60s, their 70s, who have never told anyone about what Father so-and-so or Deacon so-and-so or brother or sister did to them when they were 4 years old, 10, 17, 16. That is, the sort of thing that we try to talk about, to give voice to the voiceless, those who aren't quite ready to talk. But if we could ever have a real opening up of the files and see what the history of the church has been, not just back to 1950, which I believe this report from Bob Troyer's office went to, but see that it's been there for a long time. The systematic cover up of that abuse culture. So I'm a survivor. I never refer to myself just as a survivor, though. I say I'm a victim survivor of serial childhood sexual assault. And that's some of the things that I mentioned to you. And I'm so grateful that SNAP has come around to looking at and welcoming victims of familial assault or assault by teachers or athletic directors, doctors, and so forth. And it's really a welcoming, great organization. And at 31 years, I think it is now, it's really the original Me Too movement. And that's when I heard other people saying, well, it happened to me too. Then I've slowly begun to talk more comfortably about the things that should never have happened. And I can say to others, I'm so sorry this happened to you. It should never have happened to you. And it's not your fault. It is not your fault, which is what I've learned meeting with hundreds and thousands of people over the years at annual conferences. So thanks for asking me to do this. I'm just looking, we're celebrating 2 years very soon in our new relationship there, Cynthia.
That's right.
And I just love your compassion, your understanding, the work that you've done for the sake of all of us. You're a great representative, and I adore you. Thanks.
It's mutual. It's mutual. Mike, would you tell us about yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Cynthia. First, I just wanted to say thank you to you publicly for what you did in a very short period of time. I was skeptical initially when you took on this project, whether or not you would be able to get it done. And it was very impressive, your staff, that you were able to, in agreement with the church, do an investigation, because it's so important for survivors. But more importantly, one of the things that I had come to me, actually in our initial meeting, that you mentioned about your senior staff, and I just want to talk about it briefly, and it's not to take away from women victims at all either. But for me, it was very interesting. We had 3 women, Cynthia and her 2 senior staff members, also females, sitting at the table with 3 male victims. And it wasn't so long ago that the tables were turned. It was always men in that room where women were coming forward. And it just showed to me how the time has changed and allowed men to speak up and women supporting men. And all 3 of the women were very compassionate toward us, which was very challenging for particularly me to come forward and talk about it. I've never expected to be in a Attorney General's office ever talking about my sexual abuse by a priest. About me, I'm Michael Carpino. I was born in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, which is a small town in the western part of Massachusetts, almost dead center in the state. I went to Catholic school, grade school, first grade to 5th grade, and where I was introduced to the concept of becoming an altar boy. There was a new priest that came to town. His name was Richard J. O'Hearn. He was put in charge of the altar boys. It's almost a classic story that we hear time and time again. I became an altar boy. He proceeded to groom me as well as some other boys within the altar boy ranks. And he did that for 3 years. He made me feel special. Allowed me to become a priest an altar boy that would serve at weddings, which entitled us to have money. I came from a very average family as far as economically. And then when he decided to abuse me, he approached my mother and decided that he asked if he could take me along on a camping trip where we'd go to a camp in New Hampshire. That camp in New Hampshire turned out to be a hotel room. There was another priest that was a friend of O'Hearn's that I never had been introduced to, and another boy within my ranks at the altar boy at Mount Carmel Church. I was sexually abused that night, completely unexpected, had no clue it was ever going to happen. That's how much trust I had in this man, pedophile today, and is how I look at him. I remember after he was done with me, the way I'll define it, I remember laying in that bed, frozen in the bed, not able to move, almost unable to breathe, because as I said to myself, I didn't want to wake that monster. The next morning, the second part of the abuse was where he put a pillow over my head multiple times and I was fighting for my life. The impact of that day, that night, is something that changed my psyche forever. It affected me in trusting people. It affected me in being open to people because I had done that, prior to that. And it affected me from a faith standpoint. I'm no longer religious, and I never would even consider being religious today. But ultimately, it had a huge impact on me. As I came forward, there was, and what was instrumental to me, and this is why I speak out today, because I know it's important for victims. And one of the people, and I wanted to address specifically, that made a big difference in my life was Phil Saviano. When Phil's article appeared in USA Today and I read it, I realized that I wasn't alone in this scenario, because I thought I was one of only a few victims. And I found out that there was other priests. And then I began to study the depth of the problem. And then the other big turning point for me, where I was able to become more public with my abuse, was the movie Spotlight. I always wanted a movie to be told about sexual abuse and what the Catholic Church allowed to happen, allowed children to be abused, and the cover-up of the organization itself. So it gave me my legs, I guess, and my voice to speak and walk what the abuse has done to me as far as what my journey was. And it also gave me the opportunity to speak out, because I understand even now today how much other victims speak up and speak out about their abuse. It gives others the opportunity to do the same. And I think we all know of other victims that have not done that today. So I'm grateful for you, Cynthia. I'm grateful for Phil for doing his initial article. I'm grateful for every victim that's spoken out, and in the movie Spotlight, it changed my life.
Well, thank you both for your introductions. I think you all can understand why these two gentlemen are so special to me, and the inspiration that they have provided for the work that we have done in Colorado. I want to talk about that and ask you both if you would just share your impressions now that the report, initial report, has been released in Colorado, and nearly a year has gone by now. What, if anything, has changed? Have things improved? We certainly had limitations in what we were able to do with our report. One example is that the Archdiocese and the Archbishop told us that we would not have access to any records of religious order priests. We could not look at anyone who had been teaching in a school, for example, in a faculty, or in a position other than a parish priest, because we were told that the Archdiocese did not have access to those records, that we would have to go to the religious orders in order to access those records. And in the limited time that we had, that simply wasn't an option. So I want to ask for your reaction to that. And Jeb, you have this beatific halo on your screen. And I'm sure there's a reason for this divine apparition, but we need you to perhaps turn your screen, if you can, so that we can see your face when you talk. Do you want to answer, Mike? Do you want to?
Yeah, Jeb, I think you're getting sunset in your background.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the Catholic Church here locally in the diocese, we've all witnessed as survivors the Catholic Church saying one thing, and then we find out many years later, because of further investigations or further in-depth looking into, that they're still, they do know, and they do have records. I'll talk to myself specifically because it's classic of the Catholic Church. I settled with the Springfield Diocese of Massachusetts. They wrote me a check. The priest that abused me was a Stignitine priest. They knew of him. They knew of his problems. If you go to look at anywhere on their website, you will not see him listed. You will not see him listed anywhere. So it's the classic where they try to minimize the amount of exposure that they have with priests, so they don't have to disclose to the public the depth of the actual reality and the truth of what has transpired. They've done the same thing with women that have been abused by nuns. You know, they're skirting the actual exposure of their employees that they had hired, and allowing them to escape the full depth of the problem. So for me, the justification of what transpired has not been exposed completely by the Catholic Church, or allowed to be exposed completely by the Catholic Church, because they're protecting the organization. So it's bothersome to me.
Very much so. And I know we realized, and I don't think I was naive particularly about what to expect from the church. There were times in meetings where I was certain that folks were not being completely forthcoming. But I will tell you, there is a certain persona, a certain force, a certain, I'll call it I dare you, sort of mentality in dealing with the church. And one has to decide in the capacity in which they're working with them, how much of that to accept and let go, and when it's important to push back. But it was at times extraordinarily frustrating, and there were times after meetings when my staff and I sat there and said, well, we were just lied to, and they probably think that we accepted that, but we didn't. We just had to make some difficult choices along the way about how we were going to deal with it. But there were a lot of times, and a few times I did bang my fist on the table, but not too many, because that's not a productive way to negotiate when you're trying to get something. Jeb? And you're on mute, Jeb? Whoops.
Hey, I'd like to look at the positive side of what happened with that agreement that you so carefully and dutifully negotiated, and then as it existed, because since the report came out a year ago, October, from Robert Troyer and his staff, which was limited to the things that the agreement allowed to be reported, that he and his staff found in the records of the three dioceses. Because that, at least that was such a beginning to get more than those 18 that they admitted to, the 43. That was saying it's a bigger picture than we thought. It was also obvious in the report that there was more to be revealed. More would be discovered with continuing exploration. And then a few months later, Anderson Associates in St. Paul, Minnesota, came out with their report of credible accusations of clergy abuse, which included over 100 priests, deacons, nuns, and brothers, because they also took advantage of what they could get from order priests. And I think there are 43 orders operating in the state of Colorado right now. It's someplace around the 40. But that is an important thing to look at. That means that in addition to what the archdiocese has in its files, there are files on all these others. And I consider it really dishonest that the archbishop says that I have no authority over these order priests and nuns and so forth, the schools that they operate, because none of them operate in the state of Colorado, which the archdiocese covers, without his specific authority. No, this is a patriarchal system that existed forever, which is, it's really a monarchy if we go all the way back to what the Pope's authority is and role is in people's eyes, and legally, since Mussolini helped to make them a city state, so they have the same rights and protections of any other nation. So I think the roots of what we're seeing right now are slowly being disclosed. We have this wonderful organization, bishopaccountability.org, which has a database of priests, deacons, bishops, and others that have been identified and what the adjudication is. And I think it was in 2019, they disclosed that they had added 1,000 more priests to their list, over 1,000. I have no idea how many they've added in 2020 so far, but maybe we'll hear about that sometime during this conference when Bishop Accountability gives their report on, people are coming forward, like in the Me Too movement, and they're saying, okay, maybe these people will believe me, maybe these people will help me, maybe there is access for me. And then here in Colorado, for me, the most exciting thing is that different from 2006, when we worked on those two bills, suddenly we have several other organizations that have come on board and, as concerned. The Wings Foundation, extremely powerful. CICASA is taking a role. The Colorado Coalition Against Sexual Assault. Illuminate Colorado, which is really concerned about child sexual assault prevention. And COVA, the Colorado, the Colorado Victims Assistance thing. They offer tremendous things, and the Blue Bench, these medical professionals who hear about these things and they want to do something. But then the current Attorney General, Phil Weiser, found the funds for a task force on child sexual assault and on provisions response statewide on how we're responding to the adult victims of child sexual assault, which is one of my huge concerns, because in my 42 years of sobriety, I've known at least 200 people who've committed suicide, and many of those because they've never been able to tell the stories of their childhood trauma. So I'm saying I'm really hopeful because more information is getting out. You've been so active, and Wings Foundation is so active, and I'm wearing a shirt right now for what's called the Race for Healing, which is a Wings project on education and awareness of child sexual assault, and it really is like my thing about trying to reach those hidden victims of sexual assault that are certainly out there. And I've estimated years ago when the California SOL bill was passed, and that they had initially, I think, something like 800 and some victims come forward. And when they had a 2-year window, then they more and more kept coming forward, and more states allowed statute of limitations to change, some sort of revival of predator friendly old cases that were time barred because of these predator friendly statute of limitations. There's more and more of that all the time. So people are willing to look at it and say, okay, what can we do to protect children, and what can we do to protect and help hidden victims? So I'm excited, and we've had wonderful cooperation from the media. The various channels here have done extensive interviews with Michael and me and other victims. Many of them are Colorado victims willing to go on screen and tell their stories. And the more we do this, the more we are comfortable with the more comfortable we are about talking about all that uncomfortable stuff that we have endured. So I think there's a lot great happening. And I know when Phil Weiser, announced the outcome, or the report was presented with you and the Archbishop there, he said, I have a pledge that it will continue. It isn't over, but this is a beginning. And I've learned he's one of the people, like you, Cynthia, I've learned to trust, so I can tell my whole story to and stay at him. And I certainly trust Robert Troyer, the investigator who produced that report last October. So we're not alone. We're not alone. That's a good thing.
Thank you, Jeb. Thank you, Mike. We are so grateful that we have this network that you've described in Colorado. I think probably other states have similar organizations that have come together to work, just like SNAP is, on issues for adult victims of childhood sexual abuse. And we are happy to be a resource to any state, to any organization, if we can be helpful. I want to offer my assistance. If your state attorney general has not yet begun an investigation and you would like to see that happen, I'm happy for you all to contact me through the National SNAP organization, or I'm going to ask Jeb and Mike to give the contact information for SNAP in Colorado. But as we close, and I thank you again for the opportunity to present and for us to share our story a little bit about what has happened here in Colorado. We know that there is still much to be done, and we are so grateful that there is a network across this country of people like you all who will make that happen and who will stay with this until we know that we have protected future victims of sexual assault in the Catholic Church. Jeb, will you share contact information, please?
Sure. I always give out freely my own telephone number here in Aurora, and that's 720-608-8532. And if you're curious, that's 8 JEB at the end. And the email is simply snapdenver@comcast.net. And I respond as quickly as I can. But I just have to add one last thing, because this has just brought up so much of my concern. I heard someone say, and I've said it in my testimonies, you will never, if you haven't been abused, sexually assaulted as a minor, you will have no idea what it is to have been abused. And just like Michael and I will never, and thousands of others will never know what it is like to grow up without being sexually abused. And some of the things that many of us experience are adult ADHD, anxiety, depression, disassociation, impulsivity, low self-esteem, PTSD, high stress levels, personality disorders like bipolar disorder, and substance abuse. Those are red flags, in my judgment, that there's something going on under the surface that can be dealt with in order to get into post-traumatic growth, which is another thing that I think finally we're beginning to address in counseling profession and is in other healing professions. So thanks so much. This was a great opportunity to just meet and speak. Thanks.
Mike, last words?
Yeah, if I would, what I would like to add is that one of the things that helped me tremendously with my abuse was I got into counseling, and I started with one therapist who was basically a talk therapist, and then I was introduced to a second therapist that does EMDR, and I have found EMDR to help me tremendously with my abuse and getting through some of the issues that Jeb had addressed. And so if anybody ever wants to talk to me about EMDR and what I had gone through, I'd be happy to share my story. I know it's beneficial, at least it was beneficial for me. I've known there's other people that have benefited from it. So I would be willing to share my knowledge on what I went through with that, which I found to be a great success. I can be contacted by phone at 303-522-8956. And my email is mfcarpino@gmail.com.
Great. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Snap. Have a great conference. We missed being with you in person, but we hope that in some way this presentation has helped you as it has helped us and we've helped each other. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.